The greenhouse was alive with the hum of possibility. Thick panes of glass filtered the morning sunlight, casting golden streaks across the rows of rare plants Taryn had spent years cultivating. She knelt on the damp floor, her gloved hands cradling a fragile sprig of Erythrina calcifila, a vibrant red bloom that once thrived in forgotten corners of the world. Now, it was one of only a few dozen left. She pressed her fingers gently into the soil around its base, her focus unshakable. "You're safe now," she murmured, her voice low and steady, as though the plant could sense her determination. Taryn's passion for endangered species wasn't just science, it was salvation. Each plant she worked with told a story of neglect, of ecosystems ravaged by greed, of beauty nearly lost forever. As a child, she had spent hours in her grandmother's garden, enchanted by the way life burst forth through careful tending. But that innocent awe had sharpened into resolve when she'd learned how close the world was to losing so much of its natural splendor. She stood and brushed the dirt from her knees, turning to the sleek tablet balanced on a nearby workstation. Its screen displayed charts, growth patterns, and projections for her latest project, a proposal to integrate endangered flora into an urban ecosystem. Her research had gained attention, but not everyone believed in her mission. Too expensive, some said. Impractical. But Taryn didn't care about the doubters. She cared about results. With a sigh, she pulled off her gloves and reached for her worn notebook, flipping to a page filled with sketches of plants and scrawled notes. There was still so much to do. But as she gazed at the delicate blooms around her, she felt that familiar pull, the hope that drove her forward no matter the odds. The rhythmic sound of water echoed softly through the aquarium's corridors, a soothing backdrop to the vibrant, otherworldly glow of the tanks. Adrian stood before the sprawling reef exhibit, his hands on his hips, watching as a school of iridescent tangs darted through the coral. The light from the tank danced across his face, illuminating an expression of quiet pride. "Make sure the flow near the branching coral is consistent," he instructed a nearby aquarist, his voice calm but authoritative. "It needs to mimic a natural current for the polyps to thrive. We're not just putting on a show here. This is their home." The young aquarist nodded quickly, jotting down notes, and Adrian's gaze lingered on the reef. It hadn't always looked this alive. Years ago, when he'd taken the role of curator, the exhibit had been a shadow of what it was now. Monochrome rocks, stressed fish, and algae blooms. But Adrian didn't believe in halfway efforts. He'd spent long nights studying, consulting marine biologists, and rebuilding every inch of the system. Now it wasn't just an exhibit. It was an ecosystem, a thriving testament to what dedication could achieve. "Adrian?" A voice pulled him from his thoughts. He turned to see Carla, one of the aquarium's event coordinators, hurrying toward him with a clipboard in hand. "The mayor's office wants to confirm your speech for the gala. Something about inspiring the next generation of conservationists," she teased, raising her eyebrows. Adrian chuckled, the sound low and easy. "Tell them I'll keep it short. They just want to see the sharks anyway." Carla smirked. "And you don't?" "I see them every day," he replied, his grin widening. "But I'll admit they still make my heart race." He turned back to the reef. It's hard not to feel something when you're surrounded by proof of what care and persistence can create. The waiting room was a sterile mix of muted tones and low murmurs, the air heavy with the weight of unspoken fears. Taryn sat hunched in a plastic chair, her fingers tightly clasped around her phone, though she wasn't reading the notifications lighting up the screen. She glanced toward the double doors leading to the emergency department, her stomach tight and twisting. Time felt like an enemy here, stretching unbearably as she waited for updates on Lisa. A deep voice broke through her haze of thoughts. "Still no news?" She turned her head and saw a man sitting a few chairs away. His broad shoulders were slightly hunched, and a tension lingered in his jaw, though his dark eyes held a quiet steadiness. She'd noticed him earlier, pacing near the vending machine before eventually settling into a chair. He must have been here for Lisa, too. "No," Taryn said softly, her voice betraying her exhaustion. "You?" He shook his head. "Not yet. I'm Adrian. Lisa's been a close friend for years." There was warmth beneath his calm tone, but also an edge of concern he wasn't trying to hide. Taryn, she replied, her grip on her phone loosening slightly. Same. She's the kind of person who's always there for everyone. It feels wrong not being able to help her now. Adrian nodded, leaning forward with his forearms on his knees. Yeah, she's one of the strongest people I know, though. If anyone can get through this, it's her. Taryn studied him for a moment, grateful for his quiet confidence. You seem sure of that. I have to be, he said simply. Then, after a pause, he added, She'd probably scold us if she knew how worried we look right now. That drew a faint smile from Taryn. She'd roll her eyes and say something like, You two are making this way too dramatic. Adrian chuckled, a low, genuine sound that softened the room's oppressive atmosphere. Exactly. And then she'd boss the entire staff around. I wouldn't put it past her to start directing her own care from that bed. Taryn let out a small laugh, and for the first time since arriving, her chest felt a little lighter. You're right. That's Lisa, through and through. The shared humor settled between them, a fragile thread of connection in the midst of uncertainty. Neither spoke after that, but they didn't need to. Their presence next to each other was enough, a quiet reassurance as they waited for news. The air inside the aquarium was cool, carrying a faint scent of salt water and algae. Taryn adjusted the strap of her satchel, clutching her proposal folder tightly as she followed the receptionist's directions toward the curator's office. She had spent weeks refining her pitch. It was persuasive, grounded in data, yet hopeful in tone. Convincing the aquarium to collaborate would be a turning point for her project. She just hadn't expected the nerves tugging at her as she passed glowing tanks filled with darting fish, their movements hypnotic under the soft light. Right through here, the receptionist had said with a polite smile. Now Taryn stood before a frosted glass door, the words Adrian Torres, curator, etched neatly on it. She raised her hand to knock, but paused for a breath, brushing her fingers quickly through a loose strand of hair. The door opened before she could knock. Taryn froze, startled, as a familiar face appeared on the other side. You? Her voice came out more surprised than she intended. Adrian blinked, then recognition lit his expression. Taryn? He seemed equally taken aback, though it was quickly replaced by a warm smile. From the hospital. You're the one who kept me sane while we waited for Lisa. Taryn stared at him, her mind scrambling to reconcile the man in front of her with the curator she had been preparing to meet. Wait, you're the curator? That would be me, he said with a slight shrug, his smile turning wry. And you're here for a reason, I assume? She regained her composure, though the coincidence left her off balance. Yes, I'm here to propose a collaboration. My team's been working on reintroducing endangered flora into urban spaces. Incorporating botanical work with the aquarium's existing programs could create something groundbreaking. Adrian stepped aside, motioning her into the office. Well, consider me intrigued. Come in, let's hear it. The office was a blend of practicality and character. Its walls lined with bookshelves filled with marine biology texts and trinkets from ocean expeditions. A large window overlooked the aquarium's central exhibit, where rays glided through water like shadows. Taryn set her folder on the desk, her nerves settling as she began to explain her work. Adrian listened intently, occasionally nodding, his questions thoughtful and precise. He leaned forward, his forearms resting on the desk, radiating the same calm confidence she'd noticed in the hospital. I have to admit, he said when she finished, this is more ambitious than most of the proposals we get. He smiled again, this time with a spark of enthusiasm. I like ambitious. Taryn felt a flicker of relief, and something else she couldn't quite name. So, does that mean you'll consider it? Adrian sat back, crossing his arms, his grin widening. Consider it? I think we've got a lot to talk about. When do we start? The botanical garden stretched like a living, breathing masterpiece before them, sunlight filtering through the glass dome and casting kaleidoscopic patterns on the lush greenery below. The hum of insects mixed with the faint trickle of a nearby fountain. Taryn adjusted her wide-brimmed hat, her gaze scanning the rows of plants she'd spent the last week cataloging alongside the aquarium team. The garden was quiet except for the sound of their footsteps crunching softly along the gravel path. The pitcher plants here. Adrian's voice trailed off as he crouched beside a display of carnivorous flora, tilting his head to observe the delicate curve of the plant's lip. I've always thought they look like something out of a science fiction movie. Taryn glanced at him, a small smile tugging at her lips. They are odd, aren't they? But they're brilliant. Nature's way of showing off, I think. I mean, adapting to nutrient-poor soil by eating insects? That's kind of genius. Adrian smirked, standing. And here I thought I was the only one who anthropomorphized plants for fun. Oh, I could go on, Taryn said, her tone teasing. See that orchid over there? She pointed to a vibrant bloom perched high on a tree trunk, its petals stretched outward, each one shaped like a tiny, perfect slipper. That's Paphiopedilum ferianum. Endangered, of course, but look at it, like it knows it's rare, a prima donna in plant form. Adrian chuckled, and Taryn caught the way the corners of his dark eyes softened when he laughed. You make plants sound like characters in a soap opera. Maybe they should be, she replied. Wouldn't that make people care more about them? He nodded, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. Yeah, people love a good story. We do it with marine life all the time here. Give the sharks names, share the sea turtles' migration journeys. It makes people connect. Taryn paused, her hand brushing the edge of a leafy fern as she walked. That's the hardest part, isn't it? Getting people to care. Sometimes I feel like I'm screaming into the void, like no matter how much research I do, no matter how much passion I pour into this, it's never enough. Adrian slowed his pace and glanced at her. Hey, his voice was gentle but firm. I know that feeling. Trust me. Before the reef exhibit took off, I had people telling me it was a waste of resources, that it wouldn't make a difference. But I see visitors standing in front of that tank now, watching the fish, and I can tell it's changed something for them. Even if it's just one person at a time, it's worth it. Taryn stopped, turning to face him fully. How do you keep going, though, when it feels like the odds are so stacked against you? Adrian met her gaze, his confidence steady but not overbearing. Because I believe in it, and I remind myself why I started. Whenever I doubt myself, I think back to when I was a kid, how I'd spend hours watching tide pools, marveling at how life thrived even in the harshest conditions. That curiosity, that awe, it's still there, and it keeps me moving forward. She studied him for a moment, the sincerity in his words drawing something warm to the surface of her chest. I didn't expect you to be so... She hesitated, searching for the right word. So? He prompted, his lips curving into a playful smile. Grounded, she finished, laughing softly. When we met in the hospital, you seemed so, I don't know, larger than life. But here, you're just a person who cares as much as I do. Adrian tilted his head, his smile softening. Well, I could say the same about you. You've got this fire in you, Taryn. It's intimidating at first, but now, I think it's inspiring. She felt a faint flush creeping up her neck and quickly turned her attention to the path ahead. Well, don't let it intimidate you too much. We've got work to do. He chuckled, falling in step beside her. They passed rows of vibrant flowers, their silence companionable as they admired the garden's beauty. Eventually, they reached a secluded clearing where a simple wooden bench overlooked a small koi pond. The water shimmered in the dappled light, the fish gliding lazily beneath the surface. Adrian gestured to the bench. Take a break? Taryn hesitated, but the inviting peace of the clearing won out. She sat setting her satchel beside her, and Adrian followed suit. For a few moments, they simply watched the fish. You know, Adrian said quietly, this place feels different with you here, like it's coming alive in a new way. She turned to him, her heart giving a small, unexpected flutter at the warmth in his gaze. I think it's just the sunlight, she said lightly, though her voice wavered slightly. Maybe, he said, his tone unreadable, or maybe it's you. The words hung between them, delicate as the petals of an orchid. Taryn looked away, a small smile playing at her lips despite herself. As the koi swirled lazily in the pond, she felt the space between them shift, no longer just colleagues, but something more, something unspoken but undeniable. The botanical garden was a sanctuary of quiet whispers and soft shadows as night settled over its glass dome. Outside, the city hummed faintly in the distance, but inside the world felt smaller, more intimate. The stars gleamed faintly through the curved panes above, their light blending with the golden glow of the small lanterns that dotted the garden paths. Taryn pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders as a cool breeze brushed past, carrying with it the earthy scent of damp soil and blooming jasmine. Adrian was beside her, his tall frame outlined by the silvery glow of the moonlight. They had worked late cataloging plants, their shared laughter and conversation filling the spaces between tasks. Now, though, the work was done. Taryn had expected him to leave after they finished, but Adrian had lingered, suggesting they walk the garden one last time before calling it a night. "Do you come here often after hours?" Taryn asked, her voice soft as they strolled a winding path bordered by vibrant night-blooming flowers. "Sometimes," Adrian said, his hands tucked loosely into his jacket pockets. "There's something about this place at night. It's like it breathes differently when the world quiets down." She nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. The garden felt alive in a way that was impossible to describe, its stillness paradoxically pulsing with life. They reached a small clearing where a weathered stone bench sat beneath an archway of flowering vines. The moonlight filtered through the delicate petals, casting dappled patterns on the ground. Adrian paused, his gaze lifting to the stars visible through the open dome above. "Do you ever just stop to look at them?" he asked, his voice quieter now, as though speaking too loudly might disturb the fragile moment. Taryn followed his gaze, tilting her head back to take in the expanse of the night sky. "Not as often as I should," she admitted. "I guess I get too caught up in everything down here." Adrian chuckled softly. "Me too, but sometimes it helps to remember how small we are, how vast everything else is." She glanced at him, the shadows playing across his face. There was something in his tone she hadn't heard before, a vulnerability that made her chest tighten. It felt like he was letting her see a part of him he rarely showed. "You don't seem like someone who doubts himself," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He turned to her, his dark eyes steady on hers. "I do, though. More often than you'd think." He hesitated, taking a small step closer, his voice softening even further. "But then I meet people like you, people who remind me why it's worth pushing through the doubt." Her breath caught. The space between them felt impossibly small now, the air charged with something unspoken. She couldn't look away from him, couldn't stop herself from wondering if he felt it too, the pull of whatever it was binding them in this moment. "Adrian," she began, but the words faltered. She wasn't sure what she'd meant to say. He took another step forward, his hand lifting slowly, hesitantly, until his fingers brushed her cheek. His touch was warm, grounding her as the rest of the world seemed to fade away. "Tell me to stop," he murmured, his voice low, rough with emotion. She didn't. Instead, she leaned into his touch, her eyes searching his. "I won't." That was all he needed. He closed the distance between them, his lips finding hers in a kiss that was both tender and urgent, as though he'd been waiting for this moment far longer than he realized. Taryn's hand found his chest, the steady beat of his heart grounding her as everything else seemed to float away. When they finally pulled apart, the world around them came rushing back. The trickle of the fountain, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, the faint hum of the city beyond the glass. Taryn opened her eyes, meeting Adrian's gaze with a mixture of wonder and nervous exhilaration. He smiled, his thumb brushing lightly against her cheek. "I've been wanting to do that since the hospital," he admitted, his voice barely louder than a whisper. She laughed softly, her cheeks warming despite the cool night air. "I'm glad you didn't wait any longer." They stood there beneath the stars, the garden their only witness, and for the first time in a long while, Taryn felt like the odds weren't stacked against her. For once, everything felt exactly as it should be. The sound of Adrian's voice carried through the modest lecture hall as he addressed a group of visiting researchers, his words confident and steady. Taryn lingered at the back, her tablet clutched tightly against her chest, though the data she'd meant to review had long since been forgotten. Instead, her focus had drifted entirely to the man at the front of the room. He was poised, articulate, his enthusiasm for conservation shining through every word. It was a quality she'd admired since their first meeting, that unwavering certainty, the way he seemed to draw others into his passion. But now, as she watched him, the admiration tangled with something else, something she couldn't ignore anymore, and it terrified her. When the presentation ended and the researchers filtered out, Taryn hesitated, debating whether to slip away unnoticed. But Adrian caught her eye before she could move, his grin as natural and warm as sunlight. "Taryn," he called, crossing the space toward her, easily weaving through the departing crowd. "What did you think? Did I win them over?" She forced a smile, nodding. "They seemed impressed. You have a way of making people believe in what you're saying." "That's the idea," Adrian said, stopping just a few feet away. His expression softened as he studied her face. "You okay? You look like you're carrying the weight of the world again." She hesitated, her grip tightening on the tablet. Yeah, I'm fine, just a lot on my mind." She tried to keep her tone casual, but even she could hear the strain in her voice. Adrian frowned slightly, stepping closer, his concern evident. "Taryn, talk to me. What's going on?" "It's nothing," she insisted, but the words felt hollow. The truth was that her feelings for him had been creeping further into the edges of her focus, threatening to steal time and energy from the project she'd worked so hard to build. And now, standing this close to him, his gaze steady and expectant, the lines between work and whatever this was felt blurred beyond recognition. Adrian tilted his head, lowering his voice. "Hey, you don't have to handle everything on your own, you know?" The sincerity in his tone almost broke her resolve. She sighed, letting the tablet drop to her side. "It's just hard sometimes, balancing it all. This project is everything I've worked for. It's my chance to make a real difference. I can't afford to screw it up." "And you won't," Adrian said, his confidence unwavering. "You're one of the most determined people I've ever met. If anyone can pull this off, it's you." Taryn looked at him, frustration flickering in her chest, not at him, but at herself. "That's the thing, Adrian. I can't lose focus. Not for a second. And yet," she faltered, lowering her gaze, "and yet I keep thinking about things that don't have anything to do with the project." He was quiet for a moment, and when she glanced up, his expression softened with understanding. "You mean us." She flushed, her heart racing. "I don't know what I mean." Adrian let out a breath, stepping closer but keeping his hands at his sides. "Taryn, I get it. I feel it too. Whatever this is between us. It's complicated, but it doesn't have to derail anything. We're both here because we care about this work. That hasn't changed." She looked at him, her emotions warring against each other. "What if it does change? What if this—" She gestured between them, struggling to find the right words. "Makes everything messy? I can't afford messy. Not now." Adrian's gaze held hers, steady and calm. "Life is messy, Taryn, but that doesn't mean it's not worth it." He hesitated, his voice softening. "I'm not asking you to lose focus. I'm just saying maybe we don't have to figure it all out right this second. Maybe we can just let it be." His words lingered in the air between them, and Taryn felt a pull she couldn't deny. She knew he was right in some ways, but the risk still loomed large. Yet, as she looked into his eyes, she realized the thought of pulling away hurt more than the thought of forging ahead into the unknown. She took a breath, her voice quieter now. "I don't know how to do this." Adrian smiled gently. "Neither do I, but maybe we can figure it out together." The simplicity of his words steadied her, even if only slightly. She nodded, a small, tentative smile tugging at her lips. "Maybe." Adrian's grin widened and the tension between them eased, if only a little. For now, it was enough. The aquarium's meeting room was a cold, austere space, despite the vibrant aquatic mural stretching across one wall. Taryn sat at the long table, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her jaw locked. The dim overhead light pooled unevenly across the polished wood, but it wasn't the sterile setting making her stomach churn. It was the file on the table in front of her. The file Adrian had just placed there with a grim expression. The words stamped on it in bold, black letters felt like a slap. Adrian paced the room, his usual calm replaced by an electric tension that radiated off him in waves. His hair was slightly disheveled, like he'd run his hands through it one too many times, and his lips were pressed into a thin line. He stopped abruptly, turning to face her. "Taryn," he began, his voice low and edged with something she couldn't quite place. Was it anger? Disappointment? "This report, it's your research. Everything. Your data, your findings, your projections, it's all in here." Her brow furrowed. "I don't understand." She could feel the rapid thud of her heart, each beat a warning. "Where did you get that?" Adrian's eyes met hers, the intensity in his gaze pinning her to her seat. "From a contact at a rival institution. They reached out to me this morning, asking about a supposed joint project we were starting with them." He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Only, we haven't agreed to any partnerships. So I asked them to send over what they had. And this," he tapped the file with a finger, "this is what they sent me." The blood drained from Taryn's face as her mind raced to catch up. She reached for the file with trembling hands, flipping it open to the first page. Her stomach dropped when she saw the neatly printed title, Endangered Flora Integration Proposal. Her name was there, along with the data she'd spent months collecting, the methodologies she'd painstakingly refined. But beneath it was the logo of a competing research institute she had never worked with. "This is impossible," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Adrian's expression softened momentarily, but the tension in his stance didn't ease. "I thought so too at first, but this isn't a mistake. Someone leaked it, Taryn. Someone who had access to everything." Her breath hitched, and the room seemed to tilt slightly. "No," she said, shaking her head. "No one on my team would." The words faltered as an unbidden thought wormed its way into her mind. Someone had access, someone she trusted. "Wait," she said, her tone sharper now. "Mark." Adrian's jaw tightened, and his silence confirmed her suspicion. Taryn shot to her feet, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. "He's the only one who had full access to my files. He helped me organize them for the proposal. I trusted him." Her voice cracked, fury and disbelief colliding in her chest. "So did I," Adrian said quietly. He stepped closer, his voice firm but measured. "Taryn, I know this is a lot to take in, but we need to focus. If this information spreads any further, both your project and the aquarium's involvement could be compromised." She barely heard him, her mind replaying every interaction she'd had with Mark over the last few months. His easy smile, his casual reassurances, the way he always seemed so eager to help. It all felt tainted now, warped into something ugly. "How could he do this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why would he do this?" Adrian hesitated before answering. "I don't know yet, but I'm going to find out." The room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the faint hum of the aquarium's filters beyond the walls. Taryn turned to Adrian, her gaze sharp. "You should have told me the moment you found out." "I only confirmed it an hour ago," he replied, his tone defensive. "I wasn't going to come to you with half the story." "Half the story?" she repeated, incredulous. "This is my work, Adrian, my research, my reputation on the line. You don't get to decide when I'm ready to hear about it." His eyes darkened, his usual steady calm slipping. "I was trying to protect you," he said firmly. "And the project. Do you think I wanted this to happen? This affects me too, Taryn. The aquarium's credibility is at stake here, not just your research." The words hit like a slap, and for a moment, all she could do was stare at him. "This isn't just about credibility," she said quietly, her voice trembling with suppressed anger. "This is everything I've worked for, everything I've poured into this project, and now it's been stolen by someone we both trusted." Adrian stepped back, rubbing a hand over his face. "I know," he said, his voice softer now, the earlier heat fading. "I know, Taryn, and I promise you we'll deal with this, together." But the word together felt fragile, almost hollow. The trust between them, so natural and easy before, now felt frayed, stretched thin under the weight of betrayal and stress. Taryn turned away, staring blankly at the mural on the wall. "I need time," she said after a long pause, "to think, to figure out what to do next." Adrian didn't argue. He simply nodded, though his expression was heavy with unspoken words. "I'll give you space," he said finally, "but we need to act fast. The longer this sits, the harder it'll be to contain." She didn't reply, her thoughts too tangled to form a coherent response. As Adrian left the room, the door clicking softly shut behind him, Taryn sank back into her chair, her head in her hands. The betrayal was a sharp, bitter ache, but it was the doubt creeping into her relationship with Adrian that cut deepest of all. The conference room was silent, except for the faint ticking of the wall clock. The aquarium's massive central tank glowed faintly through the glass wall to their right, casting shifting patterns of blue across the room. It might have been calming under different circumstances, but the weight in the air was suffocating. Taryn sat at one end of the sleek table, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Adrian leaned back against the opposite wall, his posture deceptively casual, though his jaw was clenched tight. Between them sat Mark, his hands folded neatly on the table. He didn't look up, his eyes fixed somewhere on the polished surface as though it might justify his presence. "Tell me it's not true," Taryn said, her voice low but sharp enough to cut through the quiet. Mark flinched slightly before lifting his gaze to meet hers. "Taryn, I don't," she interrupted, her tone hard and cold. "Don't lie to me. Don't insult me like that." Adrian straightened, stepping closer to the table, his eyes dark with restrained anger. "We've seen the files, Mark. We know it was you." Mark's face flushed, and he shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I didn't mean for it to happen like this," he said, his voice wavering. "I didn't mean for what to happen exactly?" Taryn snapped, her hands gripping the edge of the table now. "You didn't mean to steal months of my work? Didn't mean to hand it over to a rival institution? Or didn't mean to get caught?" Mark's mouth opened and closed as he struggled for the right words. They approached me, okay? They offered me a chance to make something bigger out of it, to get it out there faster. You know how slow these processes can be, Taryn. You thought you'd get the credit," Adrian finished, his voice low and deadly calm. Mark flinched again, but he didn't deny it. Taryn let out a sharp, bitter laugh, pushing herself to her feet. "Unbelievable. I trusted you, Mark. I let you into my work, my life, and you sold it out for what? A better job offer? A shot at funding?" "It wasn't like that," Mark said quickly, his voice rising. "I wasn't trying to hurt you, Taryn. You have to understand, they said they'd share the credit, that your name would still be on the project. You thought wrong," Adrian cut in, his voice firmer now. "Do you have any idea what you've done? Like, you didn't just betray Taryn, you've jeopardized the aquarium's reputation too. This isn't just about you." Mark's expression darkened at Adrian's words. "Oh, come on," he said, his tone defensive now. "Don't act like you're some saint in all this. The aquarium's funding has been hanging by a thread for years. You were lucky to get involved in this project at all." Adrian stiffened, his hands balling into fists at his sides, but Taryn's voice cut through before he could respond. "Don't you dare try to shift the blame," she said, her voice trembling with fury. "This was my work, and you stole it. You compromised everything I've worked for, everything I believed in. She faltered, her breath catching in her throat. "You betrayed me, Mark." The words landed heavily, and for a moment no one spoke. Mark looked away, his shoulders slumping. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," he muttered. "I thought I could fix it before." "Before what?" Adrian demanded, stepping forward again. "Before anyone found out? Before you got caught?" Mark didn't answer. He just sat there staring at the table, shame and defiance warring on his face. Taryn took a shaky breath, her hands trembling as she pressed them against the table to steady herself. I can't do this right now," she said finally, her voice quieter but no less firm. "You need to leave. Now." Mark hesitated, glancing between her and Adrian as though expecting one of them to stop him. When neither did, he stood, his movements slow and reluctant. "I'm sorry," he said softly, but the words fell flat, empty. Taryn didn't respond, her gaze fixed on the floor as he walked out. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving only the sound of the faint bubbling from the aquarium beyond the glass. Adrian stepped toward her, his expression softening. "Taryn, don't," she said sharply, holding up a hand. She looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. I need to think, alone." Adrian hesitated, his features clouded with concern, but he nodded slowly. "Okay, if you need me," she didn't let him finish. "I'll let you know." Without another word, Taryn turned and walked out, leaving Adrian standing alone in the quiet, blue-lit room. The aquarium was quiet, its usual hum of activity replaced by the soft bubbling of water tanks and the faint echo of water dripping somewhere in the distance. Adrian sat on the edge of the reef exhibit's platform, the glow of the tank casting shifting blue-green light across his face. The fish darted in and out of the coral, oblivious to the turmoil churning in his chest. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, as he stared out at the swaying anemones. His mind replayed the confrontation with Mark, The anger in Taryn's voice, the hurt in her eyes. He had never seen her like that before, so raw, so vulnerable. He had wanted to fix it, to shield her from the pain, but instead he'd been part of the storm. His jaw tightened. He hated feeling powerless. But beneath the anger and frustration was something else, something even harder to confront, the fear of losing her. Adrian let out a slow breath, his hand running through his hair. He hadn't realized how deeply he cared for Taryn until now, how much he admired her fire, her resolve, even her moments of self-doubt. She wasn't just a colleague anymore. She was everything. Across town, Taryn sat on the floor of her greenhouse, her back against one of the workbenches. The scent of soil and blooming orchids filled the air, but it did little to calm her. She stared at the notebook in her lap, its pages filled with sketches and notes about the project that now felt so fragile. Her hand trembled as she traced the edge of one page, her mind replaying Mark's betrayal in agonizing detail. She had been blindsided, shattered by the realization that someone she trusted could so easily tear apart what she had built. But the betrayal wasn't what consumed her now. What lingered was Adrian, his anger, his steady presence, the way he had stood beside her even when she lashed out. A tear slipped down her cheek, but she swiped it away, refusing to fall apart any more than she already had. Adrian's words echoed in her memory. "We'll deal with this, together." Despite everything, she believed him, and that terrified her. Trusting someone again, letting him in, it felt like the riskiest thing she could do. But as much as she wanted to push him away, she couldn't. Not now. Adrian stood, his gaze still locked on the reef, a quiet resolve settling over him. Taryn closed her notebook and rested her hand on the soil beside her, drawing strength from the life she had nurtured. Both of them, separated by miles but bound by the same thought, came to the same conclusion. Whatever they faced, they were stronger together. The botanical garden was quiet in the early morning, the world still wrapped in the soft haze of dawn. Dew clung to the leaves, shimmering like tiny jewels in the pale light filtering through the glass dome. Taryn walked slowly along the gravel path, her arms crossed over her chest, her gaze fixed on the ground. She had come here before the aquarium opened, seeking the solace of the plants she loved so much, but even the familiar comfort of the garden felt distant today. She stopped in front of a patch of pitcher plants, their strange, elegant forms bending toward the light. Her fingers brushed one of the leaves absently, but her mind was elsewhere, on Mark, on the betrayal, on the research she had worked so hard to protect, and on Adrian. Taryn. The sound of his voice startled her, and she turned quickly, her breath catching when she saw him standing a few feet away. Adrian's hands were in his jacket pockets, his expression open but cautious, like he wasn't sure if she wanted him there. "I thought I might find you here," he said softly, taking a tentative step closer. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she studied him, the faint shadows under his eyes, the way his shoulders seemed to carry the weight of something heavier than usual. He looked as exhausted as she felt, but there was something resolute in his gaze, something that made her heart clench. "You're up early," she said finally, her voice quieter than she intended. He gave a small, almost sheepish smile. "Couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about..." He hesitated, his eyes searching hers. "About us. About everything." Taryn's chest tightened, but she forced herself to nod. "Me too." Adrian stepped closer, closing the distance between them until he was only a few feet away. "Taryn, I know I messed up. I should have told you about Mark the second I suspected something. I thought I was protecting you, but I see now that I just made things worse." His voice was steady, but there was an edge of raw honesty that softened the words. She looked away, her gaze falling to the gravel underfoot. "I don't blame you for what Mark did," she said quietly. "But I wasn't ready for any of it. I wasn't ready to trust someone like that again, let alone have it thrown back in my face." Adrian nodded slowly, his expression filled with quiet understanding. "I know, and I don't expect you to just snap back to normal, but I want you to know that I'm here. Whatever happens next, I'm not going anywhere." His words hung in the air between them, and for a moment, Taryn felt the familiar urge to pull away, to protect herself. But as she looked into Adrian's eyes, she saw something that steadied her. Not just confidence, but vulnerability. He wasn't asking for her forgiveness. He was offering his partnership. She let out a shaky breath, her arms loosening slightly from their defensive fold. "I can't do this alone," she admitted, the words almost a whisper. "You don't have to." Adrian's voice was firm but gentle, anchoring her like the roots of the plants around them. "We'll face this together. Your work, the fallout, the trust we need to rebuild, it's not just on you anymore. It's on us." Taryn felt a small flicker of warmth in her chest, something that felt dangerously close to hope. She nodded, her lips curving into the faintest hint of a smile. "Okay," she said softly. "Together." Adrian's shoulders relaxed slightly, relief easing the tension in his posture. He reached out, hesitating for a moment before his hand brushed hers. It was a small gesture, tentative but steady, and Taryn didn't pull away. The garden seemed to exhale around them, the silence no longer heavy but full of quiet possibility. As the first rays of sunlight broke through the dome above, Taryn let herself believe, just for a moment, that they could make it through this. Together. Adrian leaned back against the bench in the garden's secluded clearing, the soft weight of the acoustic guitar resting on his lap. His fingers strummed idly, the notes wandering into the still night air. Taryn sat beside him, her legs crossed, a small notebook balanced on her knee. The koi pond shimmered in front of them, the fish gliding lazily beneath the surface as the garden settled into its nocturnal rhythm. "I'm not a songwriter," Taryn said, her voice tinged with nervous laughter. She tapped the pen against the edge of the notebook. "I don't even know why I agreed to this." Adrian glanced at her, his grin soft and teasing. "Because I asked, and because you couldn't resist the chance to try something outside your comfort zone." She rolled her eyes but smiled despite herself. "You have far too much confidence in me." "You underestimate yourself," Adrian said, returning to the guitar. He plucked a few notes, a simple, gentle melody that seemed to echo the quiet strength of the moment. It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to feel honest. Taryn fell silent, the melody wrapping around her as she stared at the blank page. Honest. The word lingered in her mind, stirring something deep in her chest. She thought about Mark's betrayal, the heartbreak of watching her research nearly slip away, the moments she'd questioned if she was strong enough to keep going. But then she thought of Adrian, how he had stood beside her, how they had pieced their trust back together, how he had become her anchor in the chaos. "Okay," she said quietly, her fingers finally moving across the page. She wrote a few tentative words, then paused, reading them back to herself. "What about this?" She cleared her throat, feeling strangely vulnerable as she read aloud. "Even when the storm breaks the sky, even when the waves surge high, we hold the line, we hold the light." Adrian's fingers stilled on the guitar strings, his gaze lifting to meet hers. "That's beautiful," he said, his voice low and warm. "It's us." Taryn flushed and looked back at the page, her lips curving into a small smile. "It's a start, at least." Adrian nodded and began to play again, this time weaving the melody into her words. He hummed softly, testing the rhythm, then began to sing the line she'd written. His voice was rich and steady, carrying the words with a quiet power that made her breath catch. It wasn't polished, but it was raw, real, and exactly what she imagined. "Your turn," Adrian said, glancing at her with a playful grin. Taryn groaned, but the warmth in his gaze was enough to coax her out of her hesitation. Tentatively, she added, "Through the shadows, through the fight, we hold the line, we hold the light." Her voice was soft and unsure at first, but as Adrian played, she felt herself relax, leaning into the rhythm they were creating together. The song began to take shape between them, piece by piece. Adrian improvised chords. Taryn scribbled lyrics onto the page. They laughed when lines didn't work, celebrated when they found a phrase that fit just right. Hours passed unnoticed as the garden around them dissolved into the background, leaving only the music and the connection between them. When they finally stopped, the night was thick with silence, the kind that felt full rather than empty. Adrian set the guitar aside, resting his hand over hers where it lay on the notebook. "That," he said softly, "was incredible." Taryn met his eyes, her smile gentle but radiant. "It feels like us." Adrian nodded, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "It is, and it always will be." The garden seemed to hold its breath as they sat together, the song they'd created a quiet promise of resilience, of love, of facing the future hand in hand. The botanical garden and aquarium hummed with life, an intricate rhythm of laughter, footsteps, and the quiet awe of visitors. The air buzzed with excitement, faint strains of music weaving through the space from a nearby string quartet stationed under the grand glass dome. Taryn stood near the entrance to the garden's newly unveiled exhibit, the sunlight filtering through the glass above catching the soft curls of her hair. She glanced out over the crowd, her heart swelling at the sight of families wandering the garden paths, children pointing excitedly at pitcher plants and delicate orchids, the occasional gasp audible as they spotted the rarest blooms. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Adrian's voice came from behind her, warm and steady. She turned to see him standing just a step away, his hands in his pockets, his dark eyes taking in the scene with quiet pride. He wore his usual confidence like a second skin, but today there was something softer in the set of his shoulders, a hint of shared triumph. "It is," she replied, her voice filled with wonder. "I never imagined it would turn out like this, not just the garden, but everything, the aquarium, the exhibits, the people. It feels alive in a way I didn't think was possible." Adrian smiled, stepping beside her as his gaze swept over the space. "That's because it's more than just plants and fish now. It's a story. Your story. Our story. People are connecting with it." A young boy tugged his mother toward the garden's koi pond, where the fish swirled beneath the surface in a dance of gold and white. Taryn watched, her chest tightening with an emotion she struggled to name. Hope, maybe. Gratitude. Possibility. Adrian nudged her shoulder gently, his voice low but filled with meaning. "We did this, Taryn. Together." She looked at him, her smile soft but radiant. "We really did." The sun dipped low over the horizon, casting the botanical garden in hues of amber and gold. Taryn and Adrian stood on the small overlook above the koi pond, the quiet trickle of water and the faint rustle of leaves their only companions. The garden, now thriving and alive with visitors during the day, felt like theirs alone in this quiet moment. Adrian's hand found hers, his fingers threading gently through her own. She glanced at him, catching the way the fading light softened his profile, and felt a warmth bloom in her chest. "It's strange," she murmured, her voice barely above the breeze. "After everything we've been through, it feels peaceful, like we're finally standing on steady ground." He turned to her, his smile calm and sure. "That's because we built it, together." His thumb brushed the back of her hand, grounding her in the truth of his words. "And whatever comes next, we'll face it the same way." She looked out over the garden, the world she had fought so hard to protect, now thriving before her. "I think we'll be okay," she said, her voice steady now, full of quiet conviction. "We will," Adrian replied. "Always." Hand in hand, they turned toward the path ahead.